So it's been so thrilling, first of all, to see that there is a group who wants to delve into this topic in this way, and then to have the opportunity to share my thoughts and gain your thoughts as well. Um, so I've prepared now. I think Susan and Lucy explained it's a very interdisciplinary group. So in my discipline of psychology, for better or for worse, we do love our PowerPoints. So I've got some PowerPoints for you. And there's lots of images on them. I'm going to try to share the screen. So please let me know, someone, if that's not working. So today I'm going to talk about the lived experience of friendships. So really focusing on subjective experience, and I'll kind of explain a bit about what I mean, both in terms of explanation and through demonstration of some of my research. And I've realized as things have gone on that this is really about working with marginalized communities, some of which I identify with and some of which I don't. And increasingly, I've been interested in using creative research methods as providing insight into this. As a kind of nod to this, this is a very recently, new to me, piece of abstract art from Agnes Martin, housed at MoMA, which is just entitled Friendship. And really, I mean, what to make of just the image, I don't know, but I like the idea of really something quite abstract and that we have to work a lot to understand. A bit of an overview of today. I'll speak for kind of around 50 minutes, maybe an hour, and then we're going to have a short screen break and comfort break, and then come back for Q&A. I want to start by just kind of orienting us in the world of friendship, my starting point, and thinking about marginalisation, what that means and how that intersects with the way that I've been trying to understand friendship, and how this relates to an emphasis on lived experience, and why creative method seems to me a very useful way of exploring that. I'll talk about two strands of research that I've been involved in, very much in collaboration with others. So one of these is resilience for recovery from substance addiction, centered in the Northeast Indian state of Assam, India. Just a caveat, I was meant to go to Assam in June 2020. For obvious reasons, I did not go to Assam. So while I've been very much enjoying that project, it's been one of those where you get the data from afar and you work with the community partners very heavily on the kind of cultural transference. And then another much more local to me, looking at friendships and community amongst LGBTQIA plus people in my adopted hometown of Brighton and Hove. I'll shorten that to queer people because that is the terminology that people have said that they want us to use, and bring this together with some concluding thoughts. And then I'm very much looking forward to taking your questions, discussion, and provocations, right? Like, we're here to challenge things, so please do feel free to do that with me. So I want to start actually by moving outside of psychology to C.S. Lewis, who probably doesn't need much of an introduction. But amongst his many things that he did was he actually wrote a book about love, interestingly focused on different kinds of relationships. And in this, he identified friendship as one of the forms of love alongside affection, eros, lust, charity, benevolence, and this kind of more mutually expressive, very chosen relationship of friendship. And in this book, he suggests that friendship is unnecessary, like philosophy, like art, like the universe itself. It has no survival value. Rather, it is one of those things which gives value to survival. And I love this quote because I both fully agree with it. I see I see friendship as one of the enriching aspects of life, as adornment, but also vitally necessary, the same way like art is, right? But I also very much disagree with it as time goes on, in this idea that it has no survival value. And I think this is a question of emphasis, and a question that kind of comes up a bit more when you start to focus on people communities or groups or individuals who have been marginalized and kind of set aside from dominant groups. Because empirical research suggests that there actually is survival value, that where there's social exclusion, where there's loneliness, that affects us. It affects us in terms of our, kind of distress and well-being, but even in terms of our immune response in our body, as I'll show shortly. And that for many communities in many cultures and in many worldviews, interdependence and community, friendship is vital to survival, right? It's vital conceptually and as a value, a principle of life, but it's also very essential for actually the survival of the organism. And so I think this is a really interesting quote for those reasons, that it both captures a truth and I think highlights a limitation of a particular way of thinking. And to kind of lean into this, this kind of comes from a community psychology perspective, where all of psychological functioning and well-being is kind of seen through the idea that power and resources are distributed unequally, and that our way of being in the world is not equivalent, that even within this virtual room and this real room that you're in, we are inhabiting the world and making sense of it in different ways. So to define what I mean, marginalisation is a process, so it's an action that can be changed, right? It's not an inherent quality of people. But certain individuals or groups, such as people with disabilities or people who identify as lesbian or gay, are assigned a lower status in society. And as a consequence, they're provided with less access to social power, to resources, and to the ability to be productive members of society. So this can be in the form of quite explicit laws, for example, around access to mortgages, access to rights to vote, access to rights to protest. It can be about intangible powers, prestige, the soft knowledge that makes it possible to succeed more or less in a professional context, the ability to access caretaking, and the kind of informal work that really is still work has to happen. As you would see if you looked at the dishes in my sink, right? And as such, marginalization is a manifestation of social injustice. Experiences of discrimination and social exclusion are common for members of marginalized groups. So through this lens, there is a distortion of how people can access the world and what the world looks like for them. And that includes both things that are objectively observable by others, that anyone can point to. We can say, well, obviously children who are under 18, they can't vote. So for better or for worse, that's a difference between them and adults, right? Whether you consider that a problem or not is a question, larger question. But in terms of political power, for example, if that's the dimension, there is a marginalization there. Sometimes the differences are overtly discriminatory. Sometimes they're felt, right? So if people are talking about microaggressions, or people are talking about feelings of loneliness, it might be things that are held in the body as feelings of distress and despair, of ways of viewing the world. And it can be very difficult to actually articulate those to other people. And by the very nature of these imbalances, it can be very difficult for others who are not in that same position, who don't hold those identities, who haven't had that experience of upbringing, to see that. And in an ideal world, I think we would all be able to accept and validate and see and understand each other's experiences and kind of move forward with that. But that's not the world that we live in, to put too fine a point on it, right? That's not how it is. And even with really good intentions, that's not always how it is. And so I find it really interesting that, there's this subjective and objective side to marginalization, and there's similarly a subjective and objective side to friendship in terms of what you can see, the practices, the words, the expressions that you can see, and even what people can tell you about their experience. And then what is just kind of held as purely subjective is how somebody makes sense of it. That kind of, spark of like when you meet somebody and it just feels like you've known each other forever. And you can say what that might look like in terms of the conversation flowed easily, or we made good eye contact, or we opened up to each other really quickly. But there's a feeling there actually that's very hard to articulate. Some of this is quite subjective. And I think as we kind of explore the experiences of marginalized groups and identities, friendship becomes a bit more nuanced and complicated. And we can kind of see how it's shaped by these other factors, really, beyond just the connection between two or more people. Some of this, in terms of what we can see, it means that just if you're a member of a marginalized group, or kind of, and to this I say, some people who belong to certain groups also have other privileges. So I think kind of use group and individual interchangeably here. But people who've been marginalized, it impacts their social relationships in terms of being more likely to experience bullying and victimization and feeling excluded, right? And the feeling of loneliness, not being alone, but feeling lonely, it does impact us psychologically and on the body in terms of how we can respond to threats and how we make sense of our lives. Friendships are also really important for providing access to support, right? This is informational, emotional, instrumental, appraisal support. So, the kind of idea that somebody's validating your experience. And being able to connect across these lines when there's a kind of a social risk involved, that can be highly valuable and highly difficult to access. So the idea of, well, does anybody else feel this way? Does anybody else get kind of weirded out at the way people touch my hair sometimes? They're all telling me that's okay and it's because they like it, but it feels a bit weird. Now, if nobody around you is able to kind of tell you, no, that's not okay, like, that kind of leaves you sitting with these feelings. So it's both important, and it can't help but shape the context, the container for this support. Where there are positive relationships in abundance and where there's a society that's socially cohesive, this is associated with better health. It's associated with empowerment, the ability to access power, tangible and intangible, happiness and other things. And so there's kind of a question of justice and well-being driving this line of inquiry, that I'm interested in friendship for its own sake because it's such a key feature of our lives, of being in the world, and that without it, it is, as Lewis said, it's like being without art. What is it? Humans seem driven to do this. We want to bond in this way. But also as a psychologist, there's often a kind of, well, what's the kind of end point of this inquiry? And there is a utility to looking at these things in terms of if you're seeking well-being or if you're seeking justice. And I don't think there has to be a particular viewpoint on what well-being or justice would look like, but just to kind of say that we're striving towards something like that. So this means that I've been interested in these different questions that underpin the work that we'll talk about today. I'm really interested in what friendship looks like and how it's experienced when society appears hostile to people like you. And I'm interested in the diversity of that rather than having a singular answer for it. I'm interested in what meanings evolve for friendships where other personal relationships may be strained, because that's often the case. and something that sometimes, that's compensatory, or sometimes, it does. There's this idea of like queer family, of chosen family, that's come up a lot. It's kind of ideas like that where, well, this friendship perhaps stands in for other relationships, but that's not the only way in which friendships sit in relation to other meaningful relationships in life. How friendship supports or inhibits navigation of shared challenges, because friends can lead us into risky behaviors and can reinforce risky and suffering-inducing behaviors, but can also help in finding meaning and healing through these. And I'm really interested in what meanings are held around friendship and related concepts such as interdependence and community when that's enacted in the margins. And the more that I've done this work, the more I think that looking at these meanings can help us to build more radically healthy communities. And by radical, I don't mean a particular political stance. I mean this idea that this is different from the mainstream. It's different than the way many things are done by many people. And it's a challenge, a provocation. And seeing the ways that some of this support is enacted between friendships in the margins, I can't help but think, what would it be like for everyone or many people to have this? And what does it say about us as a society that some people don't have these access to certain experiences or feel a certain way about things? That seems surprising. And I'm really interested in how this is all filtered through the lens of lived experience. And this kind of comes from just a feeling that so much of friendship is about subjectivity, but it's also grounded in an epistemological and methodological stance as well. So more or less, all of my work has been interested in lived experience and in trying to understand and articulate the lived experience of the people that have been kind enough to share their lives, participants. And in terms of methodology and epistemology of theory of knowledge, a lot of my work comes in some way from descriptive phenomenology. So I'm not sure how familiar people are with this. I know that there's at least one philosopher in the room. But to kind of give some potted definition of this, phenomenology is just essentially the study of experience, and it suggests that our world is fundamentally relational, that we are relational beings, that everything is only standing in relation to other relational objects. External reality is accessible only by virtue of our experience of it. And that even, that goes for this, that, you have to kind of trust that I do exist, but you are yourself filtering my existence through your embodied experience of voice, of visual, of being in a room, wherever you are, of the meaning that your mind is making of the words that I'm speaking. And that is really as real as it's going to get. And everybody's going to walk away from this having a different fundamental experience of that. And so with phenomenology, this means that centering subjective experience, how we are in the world and our own interpretation of that, that's a given, and it's a concern for empirical investigation. So the world as it appears to ordinary people is what we're interested in. And moreover, there is something that feels like a distinct phenomenon. So, if I say love, Lewis was able to come up with 4 different categories of love, and you can see the stream between eros and affection and charity and friendship, even though they're all different of a sort. And so similarly with friendship, well, we can argue about what exactly that means and what exactly it looks like through different practices, being observable, interactions between people or objects or places, differences in feeling, differences in thoughts, and all of that will be different and variable. Thank goodness, or life would be very boring. But there is something that feels like friendship until it doesn't, right? And again, that's very subjective. What is the line? And that to me itself is very interesting, because there's some kind of arbitration of what the line is, depending on your discipline and depending on what research you're engaging with. Now, descriptive phenomenology is a very rich and philosophically dense method. And I'll just be frank that as a psychologist, it's not always easy to do it that way, right? And for the purposes of whatever the project is, it can be helpful to look at things as this is an orientation and a worldview, but not the specific method. So I've been working more on a kind of thematic analysis, descriptive phenomenological hybrid, where thematizing more diverse data sets, but always really concerned with lived experience, and ultimately often come back with the research question of what is this thing that we're looking at? And most recently, partly through work in working with specifically the queer community in Brighton, been really thinking about how this subjectivity is really influenced by bounded practices and places that, and you know, in like Ashworth's consideration of descriptive phenomenology, it holds that, because he kind of articulates that there's the way that we are relational in the world, the way that we're embodied in the world, the way that we relate to place in the world. But I'm very interested in how can you try to capture some of the artifacts, some of the ways in which we are embodied in the world, as you think about this very subjective experience. And so I'll give you an example of how we've done that. And in terms of methodology, that's really pushed me into thinking about creative methods as a way of accessing subjectivity with a bit of externality. So creative methods in this kind of generation means any kind of usually qualitative method that uses an artistic practice of some kind to generate data or to interpret data, or at some point in the research encounter, right? And that includes things like using photographs, either participant taken or taken by other people, to elicit narratives. It can include things like participatory filmmaking, collages, creating poetry, making other forms of art, creating drama pieces. There's many different ways. And for me, this seems to really work well for exploring relationships, and particularly friendships, because it does things like it emphasizes relationships. It does tend to create a relationship between the researcher and the participant that can open up trust and kind of facilitate things. But because there's often some kind of group element to it, it orients towards relationship. And maybe that's relationship with others, it might be relationship with artifacts, but it tends to kind of open us up out of this individualistic stance. It can empower participants, particularly people who aren't particularly literate, or particularly they might be distrustful of dynamics where they are being asked to report on their experiences, because that's been very disempowering for them in the past. And it allows them to control the narrative often, and control what they wish to say and how they wish to say it, and give them some time to think about that and present that. It can broaden forms of knowledge. This to me is really key, because so much of friendship and other phenomena isn't easy to articulate. Even if you love to talk, it's really hard to find the words, and the words can be misunderstood, or just they're understood differently. But there's embodied knowledge. There's the knowledge that's held in our bodies and how we carry ourselves. There's the relational knowledge that emerges through dialogue of different kinds with other people, and that is also held in the kind of forms of relationship that there are in community. All of this is difficult to put to words, and so sometimes words are not the medium. It enhances richness of data in that you often have verbal text as well, and this can give prompts for reflection, but it also adds another aspect of dimension and meaning. And I'm going to read to you in a bit some data poems, and I think it will kind of speak to the richness of what you can bring out, as well as the way that this can create empathic connection. So the idea of voice is very, can be very troubling to use. That can you give people voice through your work? You're always mediating their experiences, whether you're showing a picture they made or writing an academic article where you're really interpreting their experiences. But one thing that creative methods can do is it can create a bridge between the person whose experience you're trying to access and negotiate, and you or whoever the viewer is. And so I'll read you a data poem later, and I think it really speaks to the way that this creates connection, and connection creates knowledge, it creates understanding, and it facilitates these things. And because it kind of shifts things and shakes things up so well, and because of all these previous reasons, using creative methods can offer a very fresh perspective on friendship, and a disruptive one, in the sense that it can allow for challenges and provocations and things that you hadn't really thought about before. So at this point, I'll shift into talking about a few of the different projects that I've been working on, and that's kind of the background for the rationale and methodologies behind them. I want to start by talking about the Big Picture project, which finished about this time last year. And this was working very strongly in collaboration with mental health recovery and public health officials in Assam, India, which is a industrializing and industrialized state in Northeast India. Like many rapidly industrializing places, and like here, there's a lot of social inequality, and substance misuse disorders are a significant issue. So this is definitely a group of people who are on the margins, both because their addiction has taken them out of their lives as planned, and because they face ongoing stigma. So particularly amongst young people, this has been identified as a public health problem. And we kind of got into this because there are NGOs addressing prevention and treatment, but there's no state support for this. There's no state policy for substance misuse beyond the criminal justice guidelines for imprisoning people who do things as a result of their addiction. And interestingly, most of the models of treatment they're derived from the global north. And these include things that you wouldn't blink at, like Narcotics Anonymous and Alcoholics Anonymous, which, whereas here, have a really good reputation for supporting people through addiction. And they're peer-based, right? They're based on a peer recovery model where people are working with others. But interestingly, although that form of recovery, that form of support has a lot of anecdotal support, it's not gone through empirical verification, and there's not a lot of clarity about what is it that actually works well about that. And in this case, there's also kind of a question of what might work that is more indigenous in nature, that's more localized in nature, that really speaks to aspects of Assamese culture, like the centrality of the family, like certain aspects of religious diversity, kind of cultural emphases on a certain progression through employment, etc. And so we were interested in what mechanisms support resilience for recovery to substance misuse, and centering this on lived experience to gain insight from people whose voices are not usually included in the research and who are not really included in Assamese society. But also thinking in the sense that addiction and recovery are both social processes, and peers, but also friends, really do play a role. They certainly play a role in maintaining addiction, but they play a role in getting out of it as well. And so we used creative methods all the way through. It's a huge project, so I'm only going to give you a real snapshot, as it were, of that. But we did interviews with people who were in recovery, and they were offered the invitation to find photographs or images that they felt would help them tell their narrative of addiction and recovery. And this supported them through telling their story. And they were specifically asked about their relationships and things that they might recommend to people for getting out of addiction. And so I have here a couple of quotes and themes that I developed from the analysis, as well as on the right-hand side, a poster that one of the participants made. All participants were invited to make posters that would be part of a public health campaign and used in schools. And you'll see that the image that was selected was a gift of a clock, a pocket watch, that's the word, from someone who understood and acknowledged my journey of struggle, right? So this is what they're honing in on, is an artifact representing a relationship where they're seen and validated. So we identified many different mechanisms that supported recovery, but I want to hone in on a couple of things where friends, and I'm leaving the definition of friend really open here, not family, some kind of close bond, they played a role in recovery. So one of these was in developing a sense of self-love, right? Which could include a feeling of self-compassion. And this was often lacking for people. They had often had feelings of shame driving their addiction and within their recovery. And a feeling of love to the self was very hard to find. Daisy said, in sharing, in the idea of getting up and sharing with other people in recovery, everyone felt this, felt the kind of shame and guilt and kind of, the real hard feelings around what they'd done. And also got this. And saying all these, my ups and downs, the whole matter, looking at it from the first and last in this conversation, I thought, whatever I did right. Whatever I did wrong, that also I will take it as good. Without those, the right would not have happened. And it takes something about, my take on this is that it takes being able to share and to know that there is a commonality of experience to come to some kind of acceptance and let go of these feelings of shame and transition these into feelings of compassion and being able to set one's life in a different way. That can't be an internal process, not for Daisy, right? She needs to be able to say it, and she needs to be able to say it to a room full of people who understand it, and gain that external perspective. That's a role for her of relationship. Another mechanism was in having a sense of belonging. And this came up a lot in terms of how people used drugs in terms of, kind of finding people they thought were friends to share their lives with, building friendships around drugs. And there was a lot of real grief around realizing that they could not maintain those relationships and maintain recovery. Rishi said, today, I know that if I go out with my using friends, I will definitely get the urge to do it. And the context of this is a real grief and needing some acceptance that you have to say goodbye to those friendships. And one of the reasons I hold the definition of friend quite wide is that there's the people who are friends, and then there's the people who are friends, but, it's bad for you. right? And in friendship research, there can be a lot of concern about what's adaptive and maladaptive. Using drugs, particularly to the extent that these people did, that Rishi did, was in no way healthy for him. However, at the time, in the context of his other suffering, his friendships, his using friendships gave him a sense of belonging that he then had to fill that gap afterwards, and they got him through in other ways. In recovery, people talked about the challenges of then going to festivals and social events where friends, even who are not, kind of addict friends, are using drugs, or using alcohol more specifically. And it's a challenge for them to integrate into normal social life where they have these additional challenges, where for them, they can't drink the same way as other people. And what do you do if those options aren't there for sobriety, or sobriety is being challenged? You have to find a sense of belonging. That seems to be a universal need. But what do you do with it? And another thing that people talked about was the idea of envisioning possibilities. So the sense that at some point they can imagine a life in recovery, whereas previously they couldn't. And Riza says her friends, motivate me, like see me ups and downs of this type will come in life, means I'm able to go on without tensions are always there. Tensions will be there in life always. After talking to them, my friends, means I become relaxed. Mm-hmm. And you can't manufacture this kind of encounter. People talked about how they would get introduced to potential mentors, they'd get introduced to people, can't you be more like this person? Can't you connect with this person? There seems to be a magic to it. But here, there's something about being able to look at friends and peers and imagine a possibility of something different. And also that the words that they're saying, partly through the embodied experience of talking, really make it hit home that something can be different, right? You can't, it doesn't seem to be that's something you can manufacture. It has to be something that kind of just lands when it lands. And so here the friends are important for kind of introducing this other perspective, but there's this embodied experience as well of relaxation, of letting go of these feelings of distress that they really truly do struggle with. And so I think this is quite interesting of friendship, certainly shaping risk, but being really key. And that, whether they consider their peers in recovery to be friends or just kind of others on their journey is very, very unique and very idiosyncratic. They need to find friends. They need to find something. They need to find some kind of connection in order to get themselves out of this and in order to be carried in this way. Particularly because they're often marginalized afterwards, very stigmatized, and not let back into normal social groups. So that, in terms of questions around that and comments on it, I'm finishing up the publication of that, so I'm very happy to take comments on that. I'd like to shift gears slightly, talking about the work of queer communities in Brighton and Hove. Hopefully you'll see the through thread. Here also there's a need for friends. And here also it feels like, well, this looks more like what we'd call traditional friendship, people going out to the pub together, doing their nails. As I'm going to talk a bit about doing your nails. That's going to actually be a little theme of this part. But there's some quasi-therapeutic elements to it. And so I want to talk about this project. This is the We the Marlborough project. This is one of their images. And the Marlborough Pub and Theatre was a long-standing institution here in Brighton. It closed during the pandemic, that positioned itself as within the queer community, and particularly as being not a gay pub, not a lesbian pub, but particularly for really welcoming trans and non-binary identities and not really requiring labeling that was the feeling. That there was also a performance area upstairs, so there was kind of a lot of engagement with the arts, and the people who ran it were very committed to maintaining safe spaces in lots of different ways, and also kind of making this available as a space for queer people of color. It's now, like I said, it's closed. It's now the Artists, which is kind of, it's slightly different. It's radical in another way, in that it's one of the only black managed pubs in the country, and they've maintained it as a queer friendly space. They're also bringing in kind of a more racially intersectional view on things. An interesting kind of, talking about kind of power. There wasn't really, and there's probably not really another space that positions itself in this way in terms of focusing on people who are on the margins of the margins. And also the reason that it closed was partly due to the accessibility of the space and people feeling like they wanted it to be more accessible to different bodies. And the brewery chain wanted to enhance revenues and make make it kind of more diverse in terms of who they were attracting. And it really spoke to the precarity of this space, and that it's not community owned, and it's still not community owned. And so what the space has to do, it can't just be about facilitating community. So with that kind of background, in this place, one of my partners, Charlotte Wilcox, she was a...
Margaret, make it quiet, Mama.
Oh, is that everything okay? Read something. She was a user of this space and kind of really involved in the community. And at the time, she was doing her counseling training. And so, once you're doing that, you start seeing things everywhere, don't you, I think? And what she was saying, she approached me and she said, the friendships here are really special. They're kind of therapeutic. People are really helping to heal each other. And it was a view that even amongst very well-intentioned mental health services, the experience of queer people is often filtered through a heteronormative lens. And this can involve maybe not aggression and violence, although that can certainly be the case, but a misrecognition and a distortion. And oftentimes services, were not accessible or were hostile to people. And certainly there's a long tradition in which peer support, both formal and informal, is a complement to formal care, and it can be situated within friendships. And so together we really set out to understand what, for people who use that pub, what were their experiences of, we called it radical informal therapeutic practices and peer support. We said to them, your friendships. We were interested in how people kind of saw their friendships as helping them within this place, right? And so we talked to 10 different people of very varying and beautifully diverse gender and sexuality expressions. And we did interviews with them. We try to kind of prompt these conversations with Instagram images from the pub's feed, but actually once they sat down, they just were off and barely looked at those, whereas the Assamese participants really used their photographs. And we looked at this from a descriptive phenomenological lens. And so we looked, we focused on identifying themes about the qualities of the peer-based support in this place, where people were identifying this as forms of, as this is how they related to their friends, and this is what happened with their friends in this place. And there's a book chapter on it. I'll reference it later, but I just want to highlight 2 aspects of it that are very particular to this talk. And one is the idea that in that place, they felt safe to express the true self. And that was not a function of any kind of security barrier. That was about the negotiation, the talk, the friendships that were happening there. And one participant said, you can kind of slightly unclench. You can go, right, okay. There's lots of problems in here, but being attacked isn't one of them. Now, this is in Brighton and Hove, which, despite its many problems, but I love this place, and it's supposed to be the queer capital of the country, right? But even there's this feeling of insecurity and unsafety. And yet within this co-created space, there's this idea that here it's different. And I told you I was going to talk about doing nails, right? What a frivolous friendship activity, getting together to get your nails done. Come on, who are we? But look at this picture. I invite you to look at this picture. Here are two people who are gender non-normative in their presentation. And we've got a whole setup here of somebody doing somebody else's nails. And I really invite you to think about your favorite pub, pre or post-pandemic, whatever it is, or even your local nail salon. How comfortable, how welcoming would these bodies be in that place? And so what meaning, what significance is there in this seemingly superficial activity? It requires a level of security, and this can bring out self-expression. And that's what friendship can do. And that's, again, something that you can put the rules down, but it's only through enacting that and really feeling that it works. Another theme was engaging in queer listening, that people felt that there was something particular about the way that they listened to each other that they weren't getting from straight relationships and relationships in the straight world. So one participant said, I practice actual, you can call it queer listening, when you don't hear anything else in your head. It's like you're really listening to another human being instead of thinking about your own shit. And I find that really interesting that that person contrasts that with not queer. What does that mean about the way that we're expected, that the kind of, straight world suggests that we listen to people? And, how true is this? I don't know, but that's the person's experience, is that in mainstream friendships and mainstream world, listening still means holding something of yourself rather than fully attending to someone else. And when I kind of talked about this idea of radically recreating communities, I'm thinking, how often do I really do that? How often do I really set aside myself? How often do we really set aside ourselves to listen to others? And how come that's seen as something that's queer? Why? How? Right? So participant 3 said, I just think queer people are especially magic and just really caring and looking out for each other. Not many other people look out for us. And I guess kind of a greater understanding of respect, consent, love, different types of love, and different types of relationships, different understandings, and a lot of emotional intelligence. And so this suggests that there is something about that experience of being on the margins that, yes, creates suffering, but actually is the fertile ground for this kind of magic, this kind of growth, this kind of diversity and expansion of respect and love and different ways of relating. I'm mindful of time, but I do want to follow this through. One of the things that we did, so as I said, this was kind of a traditional research design in that we did interviews. But one thing that we took with it is we decided as a team, we wrote some poems. And then through that experience, we also started a new project. I'd like to read you 2 of the poems that we assembled from the words of the participants that I think really speak to friendship and really speak to the empathic connection that using different ways of exploring this can do. So I've got 2 very short readings. I haven't included the text here, but if anyone does want the poems, please just get in contact with me and I'll provide them. The first one is called Especially Magic. They came out to check on me. I was like, can I have a hug? 5 people came out just to check on me. I think queer people are especially magic. They were like, you just do what you need to be doing to make yourself feel better. I was like, can I have a cigarette? Well, services haven't been that useful for me. Too cold-hearted. The institution has no room for joy. I have had friends in the past in straight communities. Are you crying again? Not again. And I came down here like, this is my place. No one is going, you're being a bit too much right now. I don't have to hold myself in. Those of us who are long in the tooth feel queer people have had their lessons to learn. I haven't settled into my lesbian ideal, but this place is the linking of the queer generations, younger from older. I've got a lot of siblings at the Marlborough and parents and children too. Roles pop all over the place like a real love. And if you need anything, if I can't, I won't, but I'm not going to say I'm busy. I'll read the second and final poem today. This one is called Lay Down Your Arms. Again, all of this comes from the text that participants gave in their interviews. I feel more able in this space. Its fluid acceptance, sense of being seen, known, and celebrated fosters intimacy, a deeper bond. There is recognition, a greater understanding as we appreciate one another with compassion, without pressure to perform our bodies. Savor this belonging, truth-telling, disputes, difference, embrace the weird, the freedom to be wherever, whoever. Allow yourself to be known as you lay down your arms. So I'd suggest that that can do more or different than anything I can tell you in terms of themes. And come back to that. I'd love to know your feelings on those poems. But for myself, I feel like you have to look at it through a different lens to get the feeling. I'm mindful of time, so I just want to briefly touch on another use of creative methods. This is a very new project, so there's not going to be that much anyway, and then just wrap up and we'll have a short break. Is that all right for everyone? Yeah, okay. So on the basis of that, especially as we kind of saw the complexity of what people were talking about and the ways in which people were thinking about place and the power of art, the real power of art and what we were talking about, we wanted to lean into that more. And so myself and Charlotte and Helen Johnson, we've collaborated with other people who come from more of a practice-based background, geographies and sociology. And we started to work on the Queer Peers project. Got our nice logo there. And we did an afternoon of research workshops at the new Ledward Centre for Queer Community Life here in Brighton. And we invited people, particularly those who had participated in this research, which was pre-pandemic, and so it had been quite a while, and the public closed at that point. So we were focusing on people who used to go there, but anyone really, invited them to come together for two things: a collaborative poetics exercise, where there was access to the existing texts, and they could write original aspects and create cut-up poems. And this is based on methodology that Helen's used for many years. And also a new collaborative collage-based mapping methodology that we basically made up as a kind of mishmash of looking at emotional relationships and place-based things. We thought, let's just see what happens if we give people some instruction around this. And we asked people, particularly to try to map an experiential map of the city where they felt they could get connections with other people. And in negotiation with the participants, they wanted this to be something where they had connections with others, where they had lost connections with others because there was a lot of grief being held in terms of places that had closed or people who had passed away. removed, and what they yearned for as well, what they envisaged, what they wanted things to be. So I acknowledge this image is not very good. The picture, the map that they created was huge, and so we're still kind of getting that processed. But what it is there's the seafront down at the bottom, that little blue strip, and they populated this with things like a graveyard where a lot of people who had passed away were laid to rest, places in the sea where they went to find freedom, dance clubs, the old pub and performance theatre, the South Downs where they could go and walk, friends' houses, also places where they had been made to feel uncomfortable, like they weren't allowed to just be with their friends. And they created this through using all kinds of different media. And we're working on a publication to look at this more closely and think about this intersection of place and experience, place and emotion. And just kind of quickly, when we kind of brought this together to thinking, what was a community that centers queer well-being through connection? What could that involve? It seemed like people needed physical places and community accessible places to do things like, and all of this is so much about friendship, freely move bodies outside, find joy in sport and dancing, just be able to meet their friends safely, particularly those who present in very non-normative ways, socialize without alcohol, because a lot of queer-friendly spaces were focused around partying, explore intimacy of all kinds, and often a kind of blurring of lines between platonic and sexual intimacy, sharing massage, so having very physical ways of expressing affection with friends, connecting with other queer people of color or older generations of people, feeling safety against racism, being able to mourn those who have passed, create poetry, access spaces in non-normative bodies, and be in the sea, which I suppose is particular to where we are. And again, kind of thinking about friendship, this is, it's beautiful in and of itself, but when we're looking at how this contrasts to what we might be thinking about otherwise, it becomes, I think, even more powerful, even more diverse, and the precarity and value of these things is enhanced. So to conclude, I think that centering lived experience through different ways offers insight into the complex and nuanced meanings and practices of friendships. And I think that this does make it difficult to put easy categories on things, but it challenges and enriches our conceptualizations of support, intimacy, communication, belonging. And I think that more and more you can't get away from the idea that these meanings and practices, this subjectivity, is really intertwined with embodied experience, and embodied experience is intertwined with power. And this can lead to marginalisation. It can lead to joy. I really encourage, not losing sight of that. Friendship love can be a powerful source for healing, even though often friends are kind of, at least in psychology, looked at in terms of kind of destructive aspects. And I think that if we lean more into understanding how friendship is experienced by people in the margins, this has the potential to support radically healthy communities that look very differently to now, or at least, kind of more of the things that seem to bring joy. So I've got here just some acknowledgements of other team members and reference to key publications that I talked about and references, but mostly I just want to say thank you very, very much for your time.